You're all very welcome. You're all very welcome. Thanks a million for joining us. We're going to record the meeting, but I just want to let participants know that there's no participants will be recorded on it. So the only thing that's going to be recorded are the four speakers on the panel. So so just to let you know, and there's a possibility then that could be sent out to participants afterwards. So this webinar is part of the Cultivating the Community of Practice. It's a 4-part series, and it brings together activists, practitioners, and communities to tackle pressing issues at the intersection of racism, sectarianism, and peace building. And it's a collaboration between COLOF and the Centre for Global Education, two organisations that I know really well. My name's Helen Henderson. I'm the moderator for the event, and I'm here in my capacity as someone who's worked in community work and peace building, and here really just to facilitate, but keep things moving, and I suppose make the most of the time that we have together. I get the easy job. We have our team from COLOF here in the background who are doing all the tech stuff. So we have Aga and Bronwyn. So thanks a million to the team there that have been doing all the organising as well behind the scenes. And we're going to collect some questions as we go. So Bronwyn actually is collecting questions for at the end of the event. We'll have a wee chance to ask panelists if there's something that came up that you want to ask a question about or make a comment, and send those to Bronwyn through the chat. So yeah, we just really I feel really grateful to be here today for this event. It's a very, I suppose these are difficult times that we're in, and it's more important than ever to have the conversations that matter, even if they are tricky or contentious. And we know that divide and conquer is still very much alive and well, unfortunately, but the democratic society really needs safe spaces for dialogue. And this is something we've been practicing on peace work for years, for many years in the North, but it is a practice, and it can be uncomfortable and it can be challenging at times, but ultimately requires courage. And I really want to welcome our 3 panelists today that have taken the time to kind of present their ideas, to engage in this debate and dialogue, and recognizing that this isn't an easy topic, and we're not going to all agree, and that's okay. That's not what we're here for. And I suppose we sit here together as people, as activists, as educators, as organizations, but essentially all committed to justice, peace, and inclusion. And I think it's kind of really important starting point. We also sit here together with the risk of what we say being misquoted or ended up being taken out of context, or being targeted because of what we say. So I think it's just really important to note that this is an online space, and in my previous work, we would have sat in a wee room in a community centre with the doors closed, and we would have sat in that room from all sorts of walks of life and different perspectives and life experiences, and talked about things that were really difficult to talk about, usually to do with the Troubles, but other issues. And we had Chatham House rules, and we had confidentiality, and we had all these things. And in this online space, we don't have that. And so really, we sit here with care and compassion and respect for each other, but also for courage to be able to wrangle with these difficult issues in a public event. And I just want to say that because I think it's important, recognizing that for our panelists, you don't have to do or say anything you don't want to. I used to always introduce the law of 2 feet when I work with, mostly a lot of my work recently with women's groups. And they say, you've got the law of 2 feet and you can just use them if you need to. and we were thinking about that would be great to bring into law, but it was one of those kind of ways to give ourselves permission if there's something we're not comfortable with. That's okay, just even say it and say, I'm not comfortable with the way this is going. So it just keeps us having a wee bit of power and control on how we take the conversation as well. But also for the general public that are here, we're so delighted. There was a great uptake for people coming and signing up for the event. And I think that's brilliant. And I suppose we're inviting your voices into this at the end, but the invitation is to help us out as well and offer feedback and offer questions, and I suppose treated this as a learning space, a learning and a sharing space, rather than a kind of manifesto or an echo chamber, which we're kind of often used to in social media spaces. So it's really a chance to also forgive us of our blind spots, and we all have them. And as much as we try and decolonize our minds, every so often something comes up and bites me in the bum, and I think it reminds me that actually there are things that there's always room for learning, and there's always room for change. So that it's really just to introduce that as the space that we're holding today. And that's the kind of invitation for how we work. The structure of the webinar is we've just got about over an hour. We're finishing at 1:15, and we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn. So we've got a slot for each panelist to kind of answer, they propose their perspective and their learning and their experience, and then we have a space at the end for questions. So again, questions from if you want to pop that for Bronwyn. And yeah, like the purpose of the webinar today is really to explore how the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism impacts on peace and inclusion in Ireland, and also looking at the wider implications of this in terms of free speech, human rights advocacy across global contexts. So whilst we're looking at this in a kind of local way, we understand that this has wider, this all is connected in a geopolitical context. And we can't not recognize the current context that we're in at this moment in time, which, with escalating conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere, and I suppose, and genocide and war crimes being committed across the world, and within Israel and Palestine too. So I think there's something about this time that we're in. It's a polarizing time, and that's why today is important. It kind of makes these conversations more important than ever. So yeah, so that's our kind of my blurb at the start, but it's really, I suppose, an attempt to create a container. It's not possible to create a safe space at this moment in time in these spaces, but to attempt to do that as much as possible, that we can wrangle and share and work with these very complex issues. Also recognizing we're working across jurisdictions, we're north-south, we're east-west. So all those jurisdictions have very different human rights legislation. And I know we have the Good Friday Agreement here as part of that, but it's not just the Good Friday Agreement, and we don't need to stay too narrow to that, because there's other wider policy implications that are affecting the jurisdictions we're working on. So is that all okay with the panelists? Everybody happy? So yeah, so I'm delighted that Emily's here from the Diaspora Alliance. And we're going to start with you. So you get the hot seat, really.
Great.
But I get the feeling that you're used to that and you're okay with that. So so you're very welcome, and we appreciate that it's a busy time for you. So thank you. But could you start by telling us a wee bit about the work of the Diaspora Alliance, and what you've been doing around anti-Semitism, free speech, and the IHRA definition, and also locally and globally, but also what trends and concerns that you are seeing emerging. So I'm just going to hand over to yourself. And just so you know, timing wise, we've got about 15 minutes, so I'll probably just put my hand up when we're getting close to that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. So my name's Emily Hilton. I'm the International Policy Director at Diaspora Alliance. And before I go into that, I just want to say that I really resonated with what you just said in the introduction just now, Helen. Prior to joining DA, I was a co-founder of INAR Mods, which is a Jewish group that coordinates and challenges our community support for Israeli occupation and apartheid. And we're the largest Jewish anti-apartheid movement in Europe. So I really feel like there's a lot of learnings actually in general, I think, between the context of the Troubles and moving through that and sort of I think the Jewish and Palestinian experience right now. So thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate it. But in terms of Diaspora Alliance, I'll start a bit telling you a bit about us as an organization, and then I'll talk a bit about the IHRA definition and the trends that we're seeing, and then some of the remedies, because obviously it's always good to think about some potential remedies to these issues. And really, we are here to be a resource for folks in in Europe and in Ireland in particular to think about how do we address some of these more challenging ways in which anti-Semitism is being used and misused to push an anti-democratic agenda. But Diaspora Alliance as an organization sort of came together in around June 2022 to basically look at how we can, as an organization, through policy development, trainings, new narratives, research and analysis, and acting as a sort of resource for the broader human rights sector, we came together to think about what we can do to challenge the ways in which both anti-Semitism is misused, but also the fact that anti-Semitism is also increasing around the world. And we see these phenomena as two sides of the same coin, and that's why we feel like it is very important to be addressed. And one of the main reasons we believe that is because, as we have seen, this broader authoritarian, anti-democratic, far-right political ascension across Europe and a lot of the West, it is important for us to see the ways in which sort of misaligned our accusations of anti-Semitism are used to malign and attack struggles for human rights and justice when they arise. And that includes we believe this is harmful for everyone, including Jewish communities as well. When you make anti-Semitism a political tool or create skepticism about whether it is true, that actually makes Jews less safe as well, because it makes it harder for us to identify anti-Semitism when it does arise. And I think particularly our framework and approach has obviously had a lot to do with obviously the genocidal destruction in Gaza and the apartheid that sort of preceded that, but not only. And I'll get a little bit more into that as I continue. But in terms of Diaspora Alliance, we currently have about 50 members of staff, and we work internationally in Europe, the US, the UK, but I still like to believe that's part of Europe. And also we have some work in Latin America as well. So we really lean into and believe in the importance of this internationalist approach, in part because our opposition, and we can see this in terms of the sort of organized political right, is working across borders. It is working internationally to push this agenda. And we can see that with the ways in which the organizations and the individuals that we believe are acting in a harmful way do transcend sort of national borders. I think like the IHRA definition is actually a really strong example of that. And we believe that in order to really meaningfully address and combat these phenomena, we also need to be thinking from an internationalist framework. Robin D.G. Kelly, a famous Black American scholar, says the best antidote to nationalism is internationalism. And so this is something that we really take with us in our work. We are also about diasporism and multiracial solidarity in terms of building relationships with other marginalized or minoritized communities facing similar threats that a lot of Jewish folks do face around the world, namely, as we said, these sort of far-right authoritarian positions, but also these attacks on civil liberties, these attacks on democracy and our rights to protest, and thinking about how do we build multiracial solidarity in the face of this growing authoritarianism. And as I said, we tend to operate on 3 different levels around the kinds of work we do. We do trainings and education for folks who may not have a strong awareness or understanding of these issues in relation to anti-Semitism, what it is, how to address it. That is obviously a very different approach to that of the IHRA. We also do work around policy making and speaking to key stakeholders and decision makers to address these kinds of issues and think about what are alternatives to these sort of very problematic approaches, such as the IHRA definition. And we also do sort of narrative intervention and media work as well to sort of shift the public discourse. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who's working in this field in more detail of that at another time. But given the time constraints, I'll move into sort of my key points. So I think in terms of the ways in which we have seen this phenomena address or manifest in the last 3 years that we've been operating, but it's obviously this has been going on for longer, and many members of our staff have been really in this kind of work and trying to think about these issues for nearly a decade, basically, when we sort of saw this real ramp up of efforts to I guess, not only misuse anti-Semitism, but in particular conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, with these attempts to sort of silence debate and free speech and civil liberties. We're really thinking about how do we make sure that we balance the importance of ensuring that all minorities across Europe and across the societies in which they live feel safe, whilst also protecting these crucial human rights positions. So it's important for me to say that obviously anti-Semitism is and remains a problem in society, and it should be addressed. We are seeing from increased civil liberties watchdogs and human rights organizations rising anti-Semitism and also rising Islamophobia across Europe. And this is something that we should be taken seriously and should be part of any organization's commitment to equality and justice and human rights. This is something that we don't think it's a coincidence that these things are increasing at a time when we do have these far right the political right in ascension across the world. And that's something that we take very seriously. The challenge is obviously when we see certain political actors taking it upon themselves to make themselves the champions of addressing anti-Semitism by attacking either other minorities, as we saw, for example, in Amsterdam after the sort of interactions between soccer fans. There was a threats to deport migrants, particularly migrants from the Middle East or Africa. We also have seen this very obviously with attempts to restrict free speech, human rights to protest in relation to Palestine solidarity. And that has become very acute in the last 2 years since the genocidal destruction in Gaza began. And that this is something that is incredibly worrying because it is positioning the fight against anti-Semitism as being in opposition to either the protection of other minorities or the other protections of civil liberties and human rights. And we fundamentally reject that approach and think that approach is incredibly harmful for Jewish people, obviously for Palestinian human rights, and also for democracy as a whole. It is very concerning to see the ways in which care for Jewish people is used as justification for eroding legal principles that ultimately keep us all safe and all collectively safe. There is, and this sort of separating out the fight against anti-Semitism from broader anti-racist struggles. And I think that is exactly what unfortunately, what the IHRA, whether intentionally or not, is doing, and that is a huge problem because it ultimately does help sort of push these more nefarious political agendas forward. I want to be clear that I don't necessarily think every single person either involved or who supports that definition believes that. I think actually most people want to say that they want to address anti-Semitism and this is an important issue, and of course that's good. But the problem is that it is then being used for these nefarious ends. And so our responsibility at Diaspora Alliance is like, well, what is the alternative we can offer that allows people to recognize that they want to address anti-Semitism, but that they don't have to do that by putting other issues at risk or other issues or undermining other broader human rights or equalities principles. I think the other thing that we have seen, as I've said, is like this in these contexts in which IHRA have been pushed, whether that's in the US or obviously in the UK, which was sort of patient zero for this effort, is this real dichotomy being created by political leaders, in public discourse, by the media, and positioning a competition between either supporting, in particular, Palestinian human rights struggles or advocacy for Palestinian freedom or an end to the war in Gaza, etc., or on Gaza, excuse me, and sort of Jewish safety. And that this dichotomy also presents a political issue because it is used to attack human rights organizations and civil liberties organizations as saying, well, you don't care about Jews and you don't care about anti-Semitism, and that's a problem. And I think that we are really trying to push back against that dichotomy. And one of the ways in which we encourage that is for organizations who care about these issues, particularly anti-racist organizations, human rights organizations, civil liberties organizations, to make sure they have a clear understanding of what it is that how they would approach addressing anti-Semitism, usually within broader frameworks. And I imagine that Lucy and Shane will talk about this more, but obviously, our human rights legislation has been already set up to address anti-Semitism and keep all minorities protected, and therefore like really thinking about how to digging down into more policy recommendations that can support that is something that we can also help with. I think two more points that I want to make in terms of before I sort of hand over is like one is about consensus and one is about also what we have been doing as DA. Something that is often wheeled out around the IHRA definition is that it is sort of the consensus definition that has a broad reaching support. And I just want to say that that just isn't true. There has been very clear critique of this definition by over 300 scholars of Jewish Israel studies, Jewish studies, Holocaust and genocide studies against this definition. Numerous Jewish groups, both in Europe and the US, including liberal Jewish groups, not just sort of those who are already in our camp, I would say, have really critiqued this definition and find it unhelpful, both in terms of addressing anti-Semitism, but also because of these broader concerns around human rights violations, civil liberties, etc. And that we can provide that resource for folks if that would be helpful to sort of address that. And this idea of a consensus definition is not really part of this broader conversation. Like it's a constructed idea and we can push back against it. But the second thing I want to say is that the different things that Diaspora Alliance has done to try and address this. So obviously we have provided these trainings and we make policy interventions. We give evidence to governments in written and verbal forms. We do campaigning. But I think a particular thing that we have done in the UK, which we found to be quite successful, was strategic litigation. And we took a judicial review where we sort of challenged the government's decision over a year ago now to make the IHRA definition a central component of its anti-Semitism training contracts to higher education and secondary schools. And so we took the government to court and said this was unlawful. This is something that both violates human rights obligations. That they haven't held up their public sector equality duties, which is basically a long-winded way of saying they just broke the law by not adhering to equalities law, and that this was also unhelpful for actually supporting like Jewish groups who don't agree with this definition. This is not great. And we were actually successful in that judicial review. The government did change its expectations and did allow itself to be basically it had to adhere to its equalities obligation, which paves the way for other folks to bring claims of discrimination if the subsequent training does in a way sort of conflate either criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism inherently or says things that sort of violate people's free speech or civil liberties. So that was a really important thing to do, and really showed that when we are able to push back, we can make impact. But the other things that Diaspora Alliance has done, I think that has been very helpful for this work, is we've developed a policy position and a policy paper that gives meaningful recommendations as to how to alternatively address anti-Semitism, what is actually more beneficial beyond just these sort of quibbling around definitions. Like, what are the tangible actions people can take to address this, and to really show and embed a practice of addressing anti-Semitism beyond simply sort of paying lip service to this definition. Often what we have seen also happen is governments or organizations adopt these definitions and then nothing really changes. We don't even know whether anti-Semitism decreases as a result of this definition. No one has actually done any research on that yet, as far as we're aware. So this is actually an approach that we believe is both non-carceral, not constantly relying on the police and hate crime legislation, but actually thinking about alternative ways within a broader transformational justice position. But we also recommend, for example, things like independent monitoring, so we can have an assessment of of anti-Semitism that can be monitored, and that research can be shared so people have an understanding, and that is done alongside monitoring of other forms of prejudice, bigotry, racialized harm. And also obviously like political education. We've worked with a number of different political parties, trade unions, high-profile organizations, NGOs, to improve their staff and understanding of anti-Semitism. We've also worked with them around communications and putting these things out, and really sort of making sure that we have a clear line of challenge to this idea that in order to protect Jewish people, you have to either undermine civil liberties or be silent on Palestine. This is something we fundamentally don't believe, and that in order to build a world in which everyone feels safe and secure wherever they are, everyone's rights need to be upheld and protected. expected. So I know I've gone 30 seconds over, Helen, so I apologize. But I hope that that is a helpful overview of these issues. I just want to say one more thing I think that is important. I think like one thing that we see in societies where community like cohesion is easily challenged or fragile, particularly in the UK, we've seen this, but not only. This issue of anti-Semitism is very much abused in order to sort of fuel those divisions and hatreds. And I think in a context, and very much fuel things like anti-immigrant rhetoric, rise of far-right Islamophobia. And that's something that we take very seriously. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But I think particularly given sort of the context in Ireland right now, which with this seemingly growing far-right, I think it's possible that this issue will become increasingly part of your political discourse. And therefore having a response to that feels really crucial, and we can really support organizations trying to address that, because like when there are those gaps, we see the far right exploit it. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, and we'll probably talk about it another time. Thanks, Helen. Sorry.
No, Emily, that's brilliant, and I really didn't want to stop you, but I think those are really, really good points in terms of the times that we're in, and that fragmentation, and I suppose the relationships within communities and families, and a lot of those relationships being pulled apart. So I think, and I think that alternative, the non-carceral balance with the strategic litigation, we can't litigate everything, but also that idea that there's a deeper cultural process at work, and that's really important too. But Emily, thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting. So Shane, Shane O'Curry, you're very welcome. You're currently the director of INAR, the Irish Network Against Racism, and you've I suppose a long history of working on human rights across the island, and I know we would have met many moons ago up north in Derry. So you're very welcome. And I suppose what we're looking to explore is, can you bring some of these lessons down into that kind of inter-community setting here in Ireland, north and south, and our own experience here in the island. But feel free to, again, if there's something else you want to talk about, do add it on.
Yeah, so thanks very much, and Emily, thanks for that very very rich and detailed overview of the work of Diaspora Alliance, and for sharing your analysis. I've listened to you speak before, but it's always great to have all those points hit. What I might do is begin by just giving a quick overview of where we are at in Ireland, in the south of Ireland and the north of Ireland, with respects to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. What I can say is that in the deliberations for the development of the National Action Plan Against Racism in sort of the 2020-21, the committee which drafted the National Action Plan Against Racism in the 26 counties, for the 26 counties, met with of all groups affected by, representatives of all groups affected by racism in Ireland, forms of racism, including members of the Jewish community. And at that point, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was emphatically not raised or recommended to us by Jewish representatives, which the committee met with. And in fact, the representatives we met with were at pains to urge us to frame anti-Semitism as a form of racism like other racisms, and to draw the parallel with that. And they went further and drew the parallel between anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism, and underlined the importance of working in solidarity. So solidarity between Muslims and Jews in their very alike forms of racism as they actually exist. We were concerned that outside of the democratic process of consultations, there had been an attempt, I presume by a civil servant, to introduce reference to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into a draft of our report. We ensured that was excised because it didn't come in. It just didn't respect any kind of process. And as part of that, we came up with a comprehensive definition of all forms of racism, which was accepted by Cabinet, which is contained in the interim report of the National Action Plan Against Racism, a document which the full National Action Plan Against Racism makes explicit reference to. So that is our legal definition of all forms of racism in Ireland, which includes a definition of anti-Semitism, which is framed as a form of racism like other racism. So there's an overarching piece in that, which I think speaks to what Emily was talking about, this kind of competition between rights, framing Jewish safety versus people's rights. This is, and it was explicitly to avoid that dichotomy that we ensured that it was there. The next time that we saw reference to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was in November of 2024, when it was then the Department of Equality invited members of civil society to a hearing about the government report to UN CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Interestingly enough, there was somebody there who was not from the same civil society group that had met the Committee on the Development of the National Action Plan Against Racism, somebody purporting to represent the Jewish community in Ireland, who was fixated on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. But unlike other people present there on the day, did not speak to actually occurring anti-Semitism in Ireland, but was just fixated on the IHRA. So I just want to say that, so there's a very clear sense that there is an agenda at work here with the introduction of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And then very quickly in December and January this year, there was an article in the Examiner and an announcement by the government, by the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, that Ireland was endorsing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism without being clear, what that meant. Is it being transposed? Is it being legislated for, etc.? There was also mention in after some meetings with pro-Israel groups in the US that we might have some kind of anti-Semitism czar introduced in Ireland to accompany the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And then there has largely been silence from government quarters over that. But this of course has created a lot of alarm in civil society in Ireland, and my organization INAR is working closely with a number of groups, including the Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and crucially with Jews for Palestine Ireland, who are a decolonial Jewish-led group who are monitoring this, and we are collectively coordinating a civil society coalition to oppose the introduction or transposition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into the 26 counties. I just want to pivot a bit now to the 6 counties. Although the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is in UK law, in theory that should also apply therefore to the 6 counties. To my knowledge, and speaking to activists north of the border and south of the border who know about these things, whereas the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been invoked in a number of very public instances in Great Britain, it has not been invoked in the north of Ireland. And I think that that's a very interesting development. And I think that this is because the authorities might be conscious that to do so really risks sectarianizing the issue further, because as we know, It is the definition of anti-Semitism: sympathy for the state of Israel, solidarity with Palestinians, are issues that become sectarianized in the north of Ireland. So to my knowledge, it has not been deployed by police or by the authorities in the north of Ireland, but I stand to be corrected about that if somebody knows anything better about that. But I think that's interesting, because I think it at least indicates that there was a real hesitancy not to complicate things further for the authorities, because, as Emily has pointed out, there are really the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism really causes massive problems in terms of the upholding of rights, and they can be deployed very starkly in the north of Ireland. I would say it's also down to the fact that civil society in the north of Ireland is very long in the tooth, very experienced, very rich, and people are very quick to identify something problematic being identified in, and that's testament to years of struggle and practice in the upholding of rights. I might just leave it at that. I think that that might be a place, and I'll come back to questions of that. But those are the kind of the issues that are coming up, and I've given an overview of what's happened, how it's been implemented, what it means. I suppose I will say the other thing is that the IHRA, its introduction undermined, therefore, the process by which the National Action Plan Against Racism was arrived at, and it was done without consultation to the advisory committee and to the special rapporteur on the National Action Plan Against Racism. So those bodies set up by the government were undermined by the government's action on that. And they have been challenged by those bodies for doing that. And the other thing is that were it to be introduced or implemented or transposed, it would, in reference to Emily's reference to the strategic litigation there, it would possibly contravene equality legislation. It could, it definitely, I think, brings us certainly into contradiction of the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, and the valuing of equality of esteem, of expressions of political expression and freedom of conscience. But I do worry that were it introduced, that hate crime legislation and any future hate speech legislation could be weaponized in very dangerous ways. So it is something that the above named coalition of civil society groups that are working to monitor and oppose the introduction of the IHRA definition are very concerned about, and will be keeping a watching brief on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. Thanks a million. And I think you've been able to recognize those really tricky contexts, like the North. It's definitely, whilst we're all on the same landmass, there's a very different context, legally and politically and culturally. And I think that's, it's not without its difficulties. And I suppose one of the things since we left Europe is the rights after Brexit, and I think that's a bit of unknown territory at the minute, because the Good Friday Agreement then kind of got the Windsor framework, or what was called the protocol. And I'm not a legal expert, and I'm not even going to try and kind of do the law policy piece on that. But essentially, what the Windsor framework is attempting to do is have a non-diminution of rights as a result of Brexit, of those Good Friday Agreement, certain rights in the Good Friday Agreement, but also a keeping pace with European developments. So it creates this funny position on the island of Ireland, where the North actually has a very different rights framework to the South. And and it's quite complex. And I know that's obviously where I came across Lucy. Actually, we met at a North-South meeting, and around those very issues, and that the need for that cooperation across the border is more important now than ever. But sometimes our borders as much psychological as it is, as it was a physical border, and I think that's building those relationships is important. But so thank you, Shane. And Lucy, it's your birthday, so happy birthday. And thank you so much for taking the time to come out on your birthday. So we should definitely get some birthday emojis around you.
Well, it's nice to be with good people on a birthday. And thanks very much for having me.
So yeah, so Lucy, if you want to give us, obviously you have a background with the Irish Human Rights Commission, where we met, but also you have I love the wee birthday emojis.
Thanks everyone.
And also then your background with the work that you do around racial justice and connecting policies with practice, really, which is a really important interface, because we can talk about all the policies and laws in the world, but really what does that mean in real life? And in real life terms for people like me that don't have the legal policy background. So Lucy, if you were happy to kind of share a wee bit about the work that you've been doing and your take on the definition of anti-Semitism as well, and where it all sits. So
thanks, Helen. And I have to say, I was really interested to be part of this discussion, because my work now is very much on race equality and inclusion. And one of the organisations I worked with, for example, is Belfast City Council, writing their Race Equality Action Plan. I'm currently doing their equality audit. So I'm deep in the kinds of equality legislation and so on, but also I've worked for many years on policing and law enforcement, and the kinds of implications that legal definitions have in practice for people, both as perpetrators, but also as victims, and the kinds of protections that can be exercised in practice and actually end up benefiting those who they're meant to benefit. But the other reason I want to be part of this is because many years ago, I started my scholarship in this area actually looking at the protection of religious minorities. And that was where I started. And I started with sympathies for Jewish minorities in the Republic of Ireland after the Free State. My PhD was on policing of Muslim communities in England after 9/11 and the new definitions of what Islamists were and so on, and the ways in which communities became defined and redefined, and also the conversations about who was protected and why. And often what I found was that the state introduced definitions which protected the state more than it protected minorities. And I think that that's a kind of an angle into this. But maybe I can start with the Good Friday Agreement, since you have it in the title. And I think what's really key in this area is that a commitment to mutual respect, civil rights and religious liberties of everyone in the community, not in a community, but in the community as a whole. And the GFA set up the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. It set up the ECNI. It set up the collaboration between what was then the Irish Human Rights Commission in the Republic of Ireland and the IHRC in the North. And that collaboration obviously continues. And just to say, I'm no longer a commissioner with IHREC as of 2 months ago, so nothing I say should be implied as a view of IHREC. But I think in the GFA also you have this right of freedom from discrimination for all citizens, a right for freedom from discrimination. And that's embedded already in the Good Friday Agreement. And the conversation we're having today exactly replicates that intention of the Good Friday Agreement, North and South, East and West. And that's where we've had to think about these relationships. And Section 6 on rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity is the largest section in the Good Friday Agreement. It covers nearly 5 pages. And it sets out exactly what is meant in a variety of ways, but also the mechanisms by which those rights will be protected. And it's really fundamental to the conversations we've been having on the protection of minorities ever since. My whole career has been essentially framed by the Good Friday Agreement on this island. And I think what's interesting here is very often people say, well, how significant is anti-Semitism on the island? And who is really impacted the most by a definition? And if you take it down to numbers, the Jewish community is always going to be at the smallest end of that, right? But the point of legal frameworks is not to judge by how many, but rather the rights accorded to each. And when you look at that, it's absolutely imperative that people who are Jewish, as much as any other minority, have the same protections as everyone else. And the question then is the IHRA necessary in order to give them protections that they wouldn't otherwise have or benefit from in practice? And if it's not, is the IHRA definition the appropriate way to do that? And what other implications does the adoption of the IHRA definition have? Does it have an implication in diminution of other people's rights? Because human rights are always in balance, they're never absolute. And so these are the kinds of questions that I was tussling with. But I think it was really interesting in thinking about the North in particular, because I think it's quite interesting that the conversations about IHRA in the Republic of Ireland and the South recently have been caught up in this conversation around Gaza and our freedom of expression and our right to criticize Israel in the context. But actually, they're much more fundamental to political narratives in the North, and those have amplified in recent years, not in relation to or parallel to the Israel's actions in Gaza, but actually in relation to other things. So the highest point of hate crime reporting to PSNI on anti-Jewish crimes and incidents was in 2021, not since. 2021 was the only time when the Jewish community, very tiny, in Northern Ireland, experienced or reported more hate crimes and incidents against them than the Muslim community. On every other year, the Muslim community has experienced twice as many. What was particular about 2021? 2021 was the time that we saw 6 nights of rioting and the hijacking of a bus in central Belfast, meetings of the Executive and Assembly over objections in the Loyalist community to the Brexit protocol. So this is absolutely fundamental to our conversations about the Good Friday Agreement, and it isn't just about the Jewish community, although I would say it's fundamental to keep them at the heart of this, because they are the ones, of course, who have to have equal protection to everyone else. But to say that it's just about the protection of Jewish communities is really to miss the point on this island. And the other thing I'd say is, when we look at the relationships across the island, we've seen more and more in recent years that we've taken our policing practice from Northern Ireland, for example. There's more and more collaboration between state agencies, North and South, on things like discrimination and policing. And so there's questions around Shane mentioned that the IHRA definition has not really been adopted in Northern Ireland, but we did see somebody arrested just in August there for wearing a Palestine Action t-shirt in a protest there. But I think more fundamentally, it hangs around these conversations around, for example, the flying of Israeli flags. Anyone in Dublin in the last couple of weeks has noticed huge territorialism, really Northern Ireland like hanging of the Irish flag around Ballymun, Finglas, North Strand and Ballybock. And the police, the Gardaí, are trying to answer the question that the PSNI have been trying to answer for years, which is when and how do you take down flags? And in Northern Ireland, I think when I first went to work in Northern Ireland, I worked in Ulster University for 5 years. I very much saw all the flags that were there really in the same light. And the Confederacy flags were flying there when I was working there, but also Nazi flags, quite close to the areas where I worked in Jordanstown. But the Israel flag is quite different, and I'll tell you this why. The Israel flags have been going up since 2006, really, and they're fundamentally tied to this idea of a minority being pushed off its territory. And so the Israel flag is very much about marking territory. It's quite different to the other kinds of flags, which are taken down straight away by PSNI. If you fly a Confederate flag or a Nazi flag, they're taken down. But in December, we saw Fermanagh Council actually vote on writing to PSNI about the taking down of Israeli flags. Why? Because of this territorialism that's associated with it, and because of the sectarianism that's associated with it. And so the question of how the IHRA might impact in Northern Ireland is actually not so much about Jewish communities specifically, but actually about the ability of people to criticize those Israeli flags and their use in territorialism. An example of law enforcement use was, for example, the arson and graffiti on the mural on Northumberland Road in the Lower Shankill of Patterson. Patterson was an Irish Protestant who is known as the father of the Israeli army. And the mural has at one end a Union Jack and at the other end an Israeli flag. He was reburied in Israel. But the rest of the mural is about his role in British Empire. The rest of the mural is about his role in the Boer War in South Africa. And it really isn't around that, but it was counted both as a sectarian incident and an anti-Semitic incident. The other interesting one is the Herzog plaque, which was taken down after a number of incidents of vandalism. Chaim Herzog, of course, was the president of Israel from Northern Ireland, was an Irish nationalist, was known as the Sinn Féin rabbi. And so these kind of portrayals and framings of anti-Semitism in Northern Ireland carry all of these other meanings that aren't really as simple as they might be interpreted outside of Northern Ireland. And I think too, the other thing to read into this is it's not just the impact here, but also when we say who is informed or whose views are shaped by what we do in terms of the IHRA definition on this island. For 20 years, Israel has been bringing delegations. Now, I say the civil society groups in Israel have been coming to Northern Ireland, not the state per se. And they've been coming for 20 years to learn from Northern Ireland and specifically from the Good Friday Agreement. And leave aside any of the criticisms about what kind of society that might create and so on. That's a conversation for another day. But I find it really interesting. Those visits only stopped in 2023 because of the current situation. But still you have, for example, Women Waging Peace, the largest women's peace organization in Israel, 40,000 plus members, constantly out protesting with placards. And those placards say, it worked in Northern Ireland, it could work here. People are really influenced by the idea that peace is not always easy. You know, hatred doesn't disappear overnight just because you get peace. And finding new ways, finding models that work is important, and working towards those together. So I think it isn't just about the island as well. It's also about what we model externally as well, about how we treat anti-Semitism and how we treat criticism of Israel. And what that says about us as a society and how we treat hatred. And I think the last thing I want to mention really, and forgive me for speaking for so long, is Zionist anti-Semitism, because that's not spoken about on this island. And Emily might be able to speak a bit more to this than I can, but Zionist anti-Semitism is something that I've seen a lot within loyalist groups, and that's where pro-Israel views are not pro-Jewish views. And we've seen it in far-right collaborations right across the island, Coolock and Belfast, where anti-Jewish views are tied up with, at the same time, proclamations for Israel, because they're based in two different things. We saw in 2021, around that peak in anti-Semitic incidents in the north, we saw that in the context of a global rise in anti-Semitic incidents in 2021. Why? Because globally, Jews were blamed for the rise of COVID. And that had an impact in Northern Ireland as well. It didn't stop the Israeli flags being flown in 2021, but it did lead to a rise in anti-Semitic incidents against individuals because of that idea of Jews spreading COVID and the conspiracy theories that went around that. So I think the context of this conversation also has to be in Zionist anti-Semitism, because that is not incorporated in any of the examples from the IHRA. I'm going to stop there, and I hope my little tour of history and the neighbourhoods of Belfast has been useful. And thanks so much for allowing me to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lucy. And no, and it just shows you how complex this is. You know, it's not as simple as saying, well, these people are this and that, those people are that. You know, and I think it's you know, the media, I suppose one of the things that keeps popping into my mind as I'm listening is the kind of role of the media as well, and how things get twisted and turned on social media, and this kind of, I suppose, the stereotyping of blanket groups of people and all that, like that we've witnessed for years. But yeah, so thank you, Lucy. I'm just going to check if there's any questions. So I know Bronwyn is going to message. I'm just want to check, Bronwyn, if you want to, if there's any questions coming from the floor. So no questions yet. So like I would invite people to kind of I know that's a lot to take in because, but also really, different jurisdictions, different issues. But I think if people want to even comment or have any questions, feel free to pop them on the chat. We have no shortage of things to talk about. So in the meantime, I'll invite the panelists. Actually, what's interesting is people talk, they kind of refer to what people have said before, and maybe just if there's anything, as the panelists have listened to each other, if there's anything that's kind of popped up as you were listening, thinking, oh yeah, I would like to kind of ask something about that point or make a comment. So panelists, if there's anything that you want to kind of...
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you both, Shane and Lucy. That was so interesting and really valuable. And I feel, so I'm still on the Israeli flags in Belfast in my mind. But I think the 2 points I just wanted to pick up, I think it's a really valuable point that you just made, Lucy, around how actually a lot of these issues around the anti-Semitism, Israel Palestine, etc., is proxy for what is happening in domestic contexts, and that's a very important thing to be aware of, and why when we do the work we do, it's not just about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Israel Palestine specifically, but this is also about what politics is this serving within our own domestic contexts. And I think we've seen that, for example, obviously in the UK, we've seen these crackdowns on rights to protest that are so so strong, or like the ways in which sort of issues around anti-Semitism have been used to gut the higher education sector and attack academics. We also obviously see this in the US, and obviously in very much part, this is about the war on Gaza, but not only. And I think that's a really helpful reframe around like what is actually happening in our own context and how do we understand this in a more complex way. And that's why we also say that it's not enough to just say that this is a human, like we just support civil liberties in Palestine. Like you actually have to be thinking about what is the role of our societies in protecting all minority communities, and start from that position. We are in a much stronger position in that frame. So I really valued that. And I think in terms of the Zionist anti-Semitism piece, yeah, I think that's definitely part of this, and that often actually what we are seeing on a more global stage is the ways in which the far right and these very right-wing groups, whether that be Viktor Orban in Hungary or Geert Wilders or the AfD in Germany or Trump, obviously, who really use their support for Israel to launder their clear racist and anti-Semitic positions. These are often parties that have historically either very much contributed to anti-Semitic violence, or Viktor Orban, for example, ran an anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros, and he really started or revamped this Jewish globalists anti-Semitic conspiracy theory for the 21st century, but he gets away with it because he supports Israel. And so I think that's also what is really clear, is that also like the interests of a nation state that is not the same as the interests of Jewish people around the world, and really being able to distinguish that and make sure that we are challenging that idea that what's good for Israel is good for Jews around the world is not true, but also that we reposition Israel as just a nation state, like other nation states, that should be held accountable for its actions, that has its own geopolitical interests, and is not part of this sort of broader global conspiracy around power and control. So I think that's a very valuable intervention, and I just really, that's just what came up for me when you were speaking.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I'm just conscious I've got a message to say there's no chat, so I don't know what's happened there, so apologies, but the chat's not working, so all our participants haven't got may have questions, but we can't get them through in the chat. But I know we've got a message there from Lizzie that she was interested in hearing, so it's maybe comes through one of the staff. She's interested in any links to images or articles about some of the work that you're doing. She was interested in hearing more about the murals that you talked about, Lucy, as well. And she just said it's a brilliant webinar. So thank you, Lizzie. So just wondering, yeah, maybe in that kind of moving things forward, looking at what can be useful for people that are interested in the, I suppose, essentially peace and justice. And I think our context is that the language of war is alive and well, and there just seems to be such a push for division. So how do we take this work and move it forward? And I know you talked about the remedies, Emily, and obviously Shane, the work and Lucy you're doing locally. So if there's something, what we could go away with in terms of useful connections or actions or things like that.
Yeah, I think, if I can jump in there, last year and this year, I was involved in an all-island organization, um, where quite a number are members of loyalist communities and have loyalist views. And it was very difficult in that context to have the organization make any statement or have a discussion about Gaza and Palestine. But what I found was that continuing to make that distinction between what the rights of people were and what people's political views were, and to remind people of actually the basic human rights that everybody is afforded, and also that balance of rights that that you can't protect a nation state while harming people, while conducting a genocide. And I think in that organization, loyalist views were very loud, and it was quite difficult to get through that and to be able to catch the middle ground, because it was really a case of, oh, you can't say that. Well, hang on a second, there's always that balance, and the right to life is the top one of it. And if we're going to have a conversation about anti-Semitism or criticisms of Israel, we have to divide it out from people's right to life at that very basic level. And it was really difficult. It took 2 years, but eventually the organization made a statement. And part of the organization's fear was, what if we lose those people and we can't hold them in conversation? What if we can't speak to them anymore, if we alienate them so much? May of this year, I was in tears. I just thought, I'm never going to get this organization to acknowledge Palestine and what's happening after, years. And a colleague of mine walked out after, so many years of working on this. She walked out. And a week later, the organization's head made a statement on Palestine, which it was really, for me, it was a surprise, and I'm very glad to see it. The organization was the Church of Ireland. And the person who made the statement was the Primate of all Ireland, the Archbishop of Armagh, who didn't allow the General Synod to be split on a debate about people's lives, but rather chose to make a statement as the head of the church on that, and did it again in July on the bonfires and the symbolism of refugees on the bonfires. And I think I've learned a lot of lessons through that, of just how to try and bring people into conversation around the kinds of things we should talk about when we're trying to frame human rights as conversations that people can access and people can talk to. But it's so difficult in the context of really deep-seated cultural symbols now, which I would say the Israeli flag now is on this island, and to try and disrupt that in some way. There's a big challenge ahead for us.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I understand that struggle, because I think it's sometimes easy to label, say, well, we're, like the images of, I suppose, loyalism, I suppose coming from, that background myself. I see the media and I think, well, here's a whole group of people being labeled as this. And I think, but where is the conversation, and where is the engagement of, being able to tease out those really emotive issues? But I think I also appreciate that, at instances you're talking about people's lives and recognizing the importance of that. So I see there's a comment here from Tom. He says, is the definition of anti-Semitism effectively saying that Jews are special or above other ethnic groups? So does that run counter to the belief that all people are equal? So that's Tom's question, if somebody wants to kind of give a brief answer to that or response.
No, the definition doesn't say that. The problem with the definition, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that people went across the definition. I strongly recommend people look it up, because I think it is actually, there are parts of the definition that in theory could be okay. I think the problem is that the codification of this definition and the implication of it as the only way to address this issue and address anti-Semitism. But there's the problem with the definition that has sort of created the most challenge is that there's a list of examples that come with the definition. And there's two or three that are like specifically about the state of Israel, which actually is not related to anti-Semitism in our view, or inherently. Obviously, there is such a thing also as anti-Zionist anti-Semitism alongside Zionist anti-Semitism, where where the criticism of Israel crosses into anti-Semitism, and obviously again, if it would be helpful to think about trainings and more political education, we can do that. But specifically around examples that accompany this definition say that calling Israel a racist endeavor is inherently anti-Semitic, or implying certain things around statehood, denying Israel's right to exist, those kinds of things, which we would say is not anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean sometimes it can't be problematic or offensive necessarily, not personally from our position, but that's the challenge with this definition. And that the point of this definition is because when you apply the IHRA and you apply those examples, you do therefore put sort of fighting anti-Semitism, not the Jews are special and the Jews need, but you put the issue of fighting anti-Semitism as in competition with people's other rights or other civil liberties. And that's the issue that comes up. And so when we talk about the competition, when we talk about the challenge, that's what we mean.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and just add a little bit on the Irish context of that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, because Emily, you'll know, when it came to the Westminster Parliament, there were suggestions that 2 amendments would be made specifically about excluding the examples, and the UK government refused those. So we have that very explicit debate in the Westminster Parliament. If I've read that correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, on that one. The UK government, of course, covers Northern Ireland, right? And the CPS and other organisations, statutory bodies, have taken up the definition from the IHRA, even though it is a non-legally binding definition. And so the IHRA definition is now the form of guidance used by the Crown Prosecution Services and all other public bodies of that nature. And that's not the first time that the CPS and others have looked particularly to those kinds of definitions. After a legal action by the Coalition Against Anti-Semitism back in 2017, the CPS said it was going to run all of their anti-Semitism prosecutions past the CAA, which is just unheard of in the context of any other hate crime for any other group. So these kinds of debates have been rolling for a while, even before the UK government adopted it. But when the Irish government said it was going to adopt it last year and there was a kickback, they said they weren't going to adopt the examples. And this year, when they suddenly announced out of the blue they were adopting it, they said, including the examples. And so now we don't know where we are. What impact do the examples have? It's not supposed to be legally binding, but if our Gardaí are following the practice of police forces in the UK, then they would take that as guidance. And those, to me, are the questions that arise between what happens in law and in policy and what happens in practice in terms of protections. Emily, do correct me if I got it wrong on any of that.
Yeah.
Do you want to jump on there?
Yeah, if I can just add to that. Yeah, I mean, I think that just in relation to the points that Lucy just made about whether the IHRA is adopted with the examples or without them, that was the first thing the government said to us, is that they, the first time we suspected that there was something amiss was in November last year at the CERD consultation, when a senior civil servant mentioned the IHRA without the 11 cited examples. But the problem with that is that whether it includes or doesn't include the examples in its adaptation, it is widely taken to include the examples, but in people's common understandings. And if the accusation of anti-Semitism is going to be leveled at a protester or etc., those examples will be used in the accusation. So it will have that chilling effect, the demonizing, the kind of the demonizing of protest. So it's hugely damaging. So it has to be opposed in all its forms. I suppose just on a related question to the question of like Jewish exceptionalism quote unquote, in definitions of anti-Semitism. I know that Jewish, some decolonial Jewish groups in Ireland, in common with decolonial Jewish groups elsewhere, are for this reason resistant to the introduction of the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, because they say, although it is far less problematic than the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, it nevertheless promotes the idea of Jewish exceptionalism. Now, and I think that's not for me to decide whether that's the case or not, but I think that, what they say is basically that if you have a definition of anti-Semitism that sets anti-Semitism aside from other forms of racism, then you're going down the wrong road.
Thank you, Shane.
I can see Emily wants to come in on that.
Yeah, I think the point that we would make is that definitions aren't an effective catch-all for addressing different issues, and that they're sometimes a useful tool for helping improve understanding, but that's why we as an organization look at multiple different frameworks and histories and analyses in order to form our understandings of these issues and why they should be addressed. I totally understand those critiques of the definite of JDA, but I think also there is a point where, pragmatically speaking, people need to have something to hold on to. I think the main thing that is important is that we can understand different forms of prejudice, racism, discrimination as having both unique elements to them, whilst also understanding how they operate within a broader analysis of how power works, how racism works, etc. And there are unique elements to anti-Semitism and how it manifests and shows up, much like there is also particular ways in which anti-Black racism or Islamophobia or colonialist racism, etc., shows up in different ways. So it's about being able to balance the particular with the, I don't want to say universalist, but expansive. And I think that the more we get, but I do think that what we would say is that these definitions and this sort of battle for adopting definitions is not always helpful, exactly for the reasons you say, and that they actually can create more problems than they solve, but also because actually we do have frameworks and legislation that already protects or helps us address the issues that these definitions are trying to create or are trying to sort of are trying to bring up. That is the point of we have human rights legislation, we have equalities legislation, we can always be looking to improve those things. But when definitions, which are supposed to be a guide, an educational tool, a way for us to improve our understanding, get pushed into a codification, legal policy arena, that is when things get much more complicated and these issues arise. And so I think that that's the thing, is that when we talk about education around anti-Semitism, education around racism, it's about distinguishing between tools that help our understanding versus attempts to codify or politicize things that weren't intended for that purpose. And I think one of the things around the IHRA that's really important to bring out on this is that Kenneth Stern, who was one of the authors of the IHRA document and definition, has been incredibly critical of attempts by governments and organizations to codify and adopt this definition as some kind of catch-all document. And that he is someone who's explicitly spoken about this issue as this definition is not a tool of enforcement. And so I think, in terms of those specificities and thinking about, that's just something I wanted to add, because I think we have to, that's another very helpful frame, I think, for thinking about this conversation in Ireland, is how do we improve understanding without having to codify or say you have to adopt this or that. That's not we are here to say we improve public understanding. And we help support minorities through action, not simply just words and definitions. What are the things you're going to do to make people feel more safe and secure? How are you going to create security for all minority communities, including Jewish people on the island? And that feels like a fundamental part of this.
Emily, if I can jump in, Emily, I couldn't agree more. And I think when you look in Ireland at the way that was introduced, compared to how lengthy and difficult the debate was to introduce hate crime legislation, and how this Irish government has excluded from the hate crime legislation hate speech, which is a huge issue with anti-Semitism, in Ireland. So much of it is online as well. And so there's no real parity between this adoption of the definition as a means of greater protection, and then that reluctance to introduce hate crime legislation and a refusal to address hate speech in its form. So I think that calling that out, Emily, is just so important, that piece around the ways we get to protection.
Yeah. And I think that kind of really summed it up, because I am conscious of the time and I have nothing to add to that, and that I think it's been a really useful conversation, and I've learned a lot myself, and I hope that people that have come along have learned also. And of course, your organizations all have links, and Colov potentially will be sending this out if people want the recording. So that will be coming from Colov, and they'll have your email. But here, I just want to say, like, Gurmia Magav, thanks a million to yourselves, the panelists, to the people that have come along today and taken the time to really explore this issue. It's difficult, but I think you did a really good job of untangling a lot of complex things. So look, take care, be well, and yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Gurmagav Galar.
Gurmagav.
Okay.
I'll wait and see if somebody closes it. I'm not on the text,
Yes,
so I don't know.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close it now, and sure, we'll be in touch, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, Caroline.
Bye.